Hey everybody, it is time once again for another Rahdo Q&A. And hello everybody, I'm about to answer a bunch of questions submitted by folks like you to the email address questions@rahdo.com. And by all means, folks, if anything I talk about or my wife talks about, because she sometimes shows up on these as well, prompts any further questions from you, well, you know what to do. Questions@rahdo.com is the email address. Keep them coming, folks. I want to hear your cues so I can am. And speaking of which, let's get right to it. But, folks, I'm going to talk about several different topics today, and if any of them don't really strike your fancy, don't worry. There are links down in the show notes that let you jump around from question to question so you can listen to just the parts you're interested in. All right, sound good? Then let's go. Okay, everybody, let's get going. We've got the questions. I've got the answers. I think we will see. Starting with Olivier, who says, I've got my hopes up. You've mentioned Plunderous at least twice in the last week. I think it was in a ramble and in the weekly recap. Do you know if the game is ready to re-enter crowdfunding in the next few months? And are you still involved in the co-op design? I am definitely still involved in the design of this game, as I have been now helping out my very close friend for, the last 3 or 4 maybe even 5 years now. I've been giving him all kinds of feedback. I've played it now probably at least a dozen times on Tabletopia, and I think it's amazing. You know, a 4X game for people who don't like 4X. And it is perpetually just a few months away from re-entering crowdfunding. The biggest hurdle that he has is he is relying on a friend, a very talented graphic designer friend, to do all of the graphic design, and his friend has a life. And, it's interesting. I think a couple of months ago, he actually tried to bring on, another graphic designer to help out or maybe pick up the slack or whatever. But it turns out his graphic designer friend was working in such a weird way that the new graphic designer couldn't make head or tails of the file formats and stuff like that. So that is still continuing to be the holdup, and my friend Andrew is still hoping to get the game, onto Kickstarter, or I think he would go Kickstarter again before the end of the year. But it's still in limbo. The game has definitely evolved a lot over the last couple of years, a lot. And one of those evolutions is he has put the co-op module that I was, kind of co-designing on the back burner so that he could, put all his focus on making sure it's a really great competitive game and also has a really solid solo mode. So, the solo mode is going to be using the same kind of element that the co-op mode was based on, but it's going to be a little bit more stripped down and just be kind of like a streamlined, hey, look, just recreate the multiplayer experience with this solo mode, and if it is successful, it'll get a co-op mode somewhere down the road. He's also, not for nothing, designed a whole expansion worth of content, too. I don't know if that's going to be something that it will be part of the crowdfunding campaign, but it's really, really cool, too. He's even gotten some original art from the Miko for it. But I think all his focus is just on making sure the core game is ready to go. And he's such a perfectionist, he just will not do it until he's got all the finalized, updated graphic design art. He actually showed it to some of our mutual acquaintances in the board game publishing industry and got feedback from them as well. And that led to a lot of, you should really change this, and this in terms of the look, which means, once again, the game is going to be undergoing a big graphic design overhaul with the feedback we've gotten from various publishers who really know their stuff. So maybe, but honestly, at this point, if I were a betting man, I wouldn't hold your breath and assume maybe we'll see it. Here's the problem. I was going to say maybe we'll see it in early 2024. But the problem there is Jen and I are still going to be on the road in early 2024, and I know he will. I did a free run-through preview for him when he put it up last time. And I know he'd want to do it again. So he might end up waiting until Jen and I get back, which means it might not go on crowdfunding until April of next year. Now, like I said, he is, he's a full-time dad. He's got a lot of stuff going on, but he is definitely trying to make this thing happen. But honestly, I wouldn't expect to see it until sometime in early 2024. If I were a betting man. Okay, next up, Daniel says, a while ago you mentioned your friend, the same friend, was doing a Gloomhaven roll and write. What's the latest update on the game, please? Well, It has been definitely put on the shelf until Plunderous can be done. Although, man, before that happened, it changed. I got so excited about it because he shifted it from a high fantasy Gloomhaven setting to a futuristic sci-fi adventure Star Trek style setting, which makes me personally so much more excited about it. Because he did this because he knows I love Star Wars, or not Star Wars, Star Trek so much. And so, we did a lot of back and forth on that too. And man, there are some amazing innovative ideas in there, unlike anything the industry has ever seen before. And, but like I said, one thing at a time, he's really got to get Plunderous done and dusted. So, that Gloomhaven roll and write turned into a sci-fi game that is just so awesome. He actually had me send him my copy of, Unsettled from Orange Nebula, because he knew what a big fan I was of that, and he wanted to see, how was this hard sci-fi brought into a game? So he's taking inspiration from that. He's taking inspiration from Gloomhaven. He's making it a roller. And I honestly, there are some elements of this design that are so forward-thinking, I don't want to actually say them out loud because I know it's going to be a while before this comes to fruition, and I don't want anybody else to take those ideas. So, unfortunately, that one is even farther off. I'm sorry, Daniel, but I'm right there with you. I'm excited for it, too. Let's see. Then we've got Joseph, who says, I wanted to ask you your thoughts about automa systems that either allow for solo play or for a richer experience at lower player counts. What are your top 3 automa systems? Is Joseph for a question. I don't know that I have a top 3 because honestly, I am not a solo gamer. For me, my favorite thing about solo gaming is it makes it so much more fun for me to film Rahdo run-throughs. Because when I film a solo run-through, and I only ever choose to do a solo run-through of a game, when I feel that the solo mode really captures the feel of the multiplayer game, which is to say it has usually a really good automa that is nice and simple and streamlined, doesn't slow the game down, but still gives you a sense for what it feels like to compete against somebody else. So that my video does double duty. It's good for solo fans to see what the game is like, but multiplayer fans still get a good sense for what the kind of choices and challenges they'll be faced with. But again, I don't go out of my way I play board games not solo. I play with my wife, Jen. If Jen weren't here, I would not be playing solo board games. I'd probably be catching up on my YouTube queue or trying to read more, quite frankly. So what I will say, I won't name, 3 specific systems for 3 specific games, but I will say what I like to see. As a general rule, a good automa system, for my taste anyway. Well, really, there are 2 broad approaches to how you could do an automa. And to me, they're typified by the approach of the Automa Factory or Morten Monrad Peterson specifically, or the approach favored usually by Dave Turczi, another design superstar who does a lot of solo modes. And Morten and Automa, they always try to, with as simple and streamlined a system as possible. Usually just, a couple of cards that you read from that combine to create interesting things. They emulate the end result of what another human player would do, grabbing resources, blocking my paths to victory, creating opportunities for me, whatever it might be. The more simple and streamlined a system, as far as I'm concerned, the better. Dave Turczi tends, on the opposite, to go for big, complex things that don't only emulate the outcome of another human player, but emulate the thought process of another player, that emulate all the individual little steps. And to me, I appreciate why they are very popular and why Dave is celebrated for his solo designs, but I would rather, and again, this is mostly because I'm really only playing these things when I'm doing solo run-throughs, the simpler and cleaner and more elegant, the better. What I think is very important then, when you're developing a nice, simple, streamlined, elegant automa system, is that it's capable of achieving the output of a human player, not the actual moves of a human player, but just the output of a human player. And it has to have some degree of predictability. Like, the best example I can think of, I know this has been done several times. Hey, the cards are two-sided, and one side of the card gives you, when you're making your turn and you can see, I can see half. I can see one of the two cards that the automa is going to use to make their decisions for what they're going to do on their turn. So I could take an educated guess that, it's likely they're going to focus on this element over here. I can't guarantee it because I haven't seen the other cards. So I haven't seen the other half of what they're going to do. But I could make an educated guess and bend my decisions towards that. That's what you do in a good multiplayer game. A multiplayer game where I do pay attention to what Jen is up to and where she might go and where I think I can push my luck and wait on something because I can focus on other things. I want to have that same interaction, that same quasi somewhat predictability. So that's really important. And again, Automa Systems Factory does this really well, and so does Dave Turczi, but I'd rather have it done in a simpler, more elegant, clean solution. Also, strictly speaking, I'd like a system that feels like I'm literally beating somebody else, that I can see over the course of the game, how their score is accumulating, and it's a satisfying win, as opposed to beat my own high score. So really, what are my top three? The three automa systems that do those three things in combination the best would be my top three. I don't know what those are, though, because I really don't catalog it. However, for folks who don't know but are interested, apparently like Joseph, I don't know if you know, I recently started keeping track of every single solo run-through that appears on the channel, going all the way back to the beginning. You can find it at solo.rahdo.com. It's a geek list on Board Game Geek, and subscribe to that so you'll always know when I'm putting new solo run-throughs up, either that I did or Kimberly did or Ruel or whatever. Anyway, though. Question 2. Would you prefer to have the automa system that's easy to manage and replicates player interaction poorly, or a difficult automa to manage that replicates player interaction perfectly? So that's a continuation. Obviously, I said I'd rather have a simple, easy-to-run automa rather than a super complex one. But then you've added those extra caveats. Okay, do you want the simple one that doesn't really do that good a job of replicating the feel of a human opponent or interaction with a human opponent? And honestly, yes, I would still rather have that. Again, the pyramid from Teotihuacan that Dave Turczi did was brilliant and is really clever, and it's a fun little puzzle in its own right. But Teotihuacan already has enough for me to keep track of without having to, manhandle all these extra elements into my brain. Was it Teotihuacan he did that, or was it Tekenu? I don't remember. Either way, and yes, while I appreciate that a big complex thing does a better job of one of my core pillars that I want from an automa player, that sense that I do have a real opponent who I can predict. If I had to give up that prediction, I just mentioned the three things, simplicity and clean, elegant implementation, that sense of interaction and predictability. That's less the interaction, more the predictability, and beating something as opposed to beating a high score chart on a classic arcade game. To me, those are the big three things. Really, what you're asking, how do I rank those? And honestly, I rank ease of play higher than the other two. If I were to rank those three things, which I think would answer your question, ease of play would be number one. And number two, I think, would be the interaction, the predictability of another opponent. And honestly, if I could have both of those, I don't mind if the opponent never actually scores any points. And I'm okay with just trying to beat a high score, saying, oh, yeah, I got 87 points. Oh, that means I got a mid score or I failed or whatever. I'm okay with that. It's not my favorite, but I would happily sacrifice that to get the other two. And if you're talking about the two and I have to sacrifice one or the other, the clean, elegant simplicity or that sense of predictive interaction, I will give up the interaction to keep the clean. And truly feel like I'm all alone in the simulation. That's how I would prioritize those things. Question 3: which of my top 10 personal games would I like to see with an automa system? Good question. Let's go to the browser because I don't remember what my top 10 games are. What is that? How do you get to that? You go to games.rahdo.com, right? Games.rahdo.com. Okay, games.rahdo.com. There we go. Oh, because I left out the A. That's why Google didn't find it. It's opening. Here we go. All right, so my top 10 games of all time today are Dominion, Keyflower, Peloponnese, Nations, Troyes, Agricola, Gloomhaven, Castles of Burgundy, Shadowrun Crossfire, and Pandemic. Okay, and so the question was, which of these would I... Right, which... Okay, you didn't say, so I'm assuming you're saying... Okay, well, first of all, Shadowrun Crossfire... Shadowrun Crossfire and Pandemic are both cooperative games, right? So any cooperative game you can play solo if you want. But boy, I would really like a version of Shadowrun Crossfire where I don't have to play two-handed. But, I mean, it doesn't require a full automa for that. Neither Pandemic... Actually, Pandemic does have... One of the expansions introduced a very, very cool system that basically did a quasi-solo. It was like, hey, the CDC is an extra resource you can leverage, and you can turn Pandemic into a true solo game that way. So I don't need Pandemic. And while I'd really love Shadowrun Crossfire, it wouldn't be for an automa. I wouldn't want an automa. I wouldn't want a teammate. I would just want things, tweaked a bit so that I could feel like I have got a shot at playing just pure solo, which means I'd have to lose the abort system and all that, but that would be okay. So it's really the competitive games in my top 10 that I would most want. Let's see. Agricola, I don't feel like I need that. Agricola already has a solo mode built in. I don't feel like if I were... I'm trying to imagine if I wanted to sit down and play one of these games solo, which one would I most want to be... I guess that's actually the question. Which of my top 10 would I most want to be able to play solo? I probably... Honestly, of my top 10... Oops, and I missed one of my top 10. Dominion, yeah. I would probably want to be able... Dominion, honestly, I don't think needs an automa. Dominion, I think, would be perfectly fine saying, hey, you know what? You have to get X number of provinces and X number of turns to do a win. And I'd be satisfied with that. And, turning it more into a puzzle, right? Nations is the one that really jumps out at me. That if in my personal top 10, if I were to play anything, which one would I want to play as a solo game? I think it would be Nations, because Nations of all of these games... Yeah, I'm going to say it's tied with Agricola. Has I think the most interesting and engaging story. Obviously telling the evolution of mankind throughout centuries of development, and there's enough really interesting interaction directly between players because of the military track and whatnot that I think Nations would benefit most. I think. Oh, okay, Gloomhaven is in my top 10 too, and I'll leave the same thing out. Gloomhaven has like a dozen different true solo missions that have already been designed. I wish Isaac would design more, but that's okay. I don't think, But you know what? Honestly, I kind of do come back to Shadowrun Crossfire. I think that would be the one I'd want next most. Because I'd be very, very happy if Shadowrun Crossfire could just get some tweaks to the existing system so that, just giving you a little bit more starting resources or whatever it might be so that it could be a viable game to play truly with only one hero. But I would be bummed by losing what so much of what makes Shadowrun Crossfire to me is that notion of, hey, it's you and me working together, and if you go down, I've got to save both of us. If I go down, you've got to save both of us. More I think about it, I would like an automa. I would like kind of along the lines of what Oathsworn does. I haven't played Oathsworn yet. I'm hoping to before the end of the year, because when we drive through Los Angeles, I am swinging by Shay's place, and I am grabbing Oathsworn from him, and Jen and I will play it south of the border in Mexico. But I really love that Oathsworn says, hey, it's supposed to be a 4-hero game, and if you're going to play 2 players, each player controls a hero, but then they have sidekicks that are very simplified, streamlined, automated players. I would love to see something like that brought into Shadowrun Crossfire. An automated player. Honestly, an automated player that kind of makes decisions on its own, and I don't just get to tell it what to do. And, so, hey, I've got my big thing. I do all my normal stuff, and then my automated teammate, who has their own bad guys that are hitting him, will do some automated choices. And I can kind of guess what they're going to do, but sometimes they'll fight, sometimes they'll heal, whatever. I mean, they don't even need a deck. They just need a die to roll against a probability chart and some simple things. Because I really like that idea of being in Shadowrun Crossfire with somebody. And if they go down, I've got to save them. And if I go down, they've got to save me. And I would assume at that point, if I went down and they've got to save me, that I'd be able to like get into control of them and have like a slightly more robust, or no, actually it wouldn't even need to be that. I could see it. Okay. I'm really liking this idea the more I think about it. There's an automated sidekick character, and if they go down, and they make choices, and I can kind of think what they're going to do, and maybe I can exert some influence and force them to do certain things at certain points, but they are their own quasi-unpredictable thing, kind of like, the pets in Dungeon Pets. And if they go down, I've got to survive that one more round, taking on everything they've got. If I go down, they've got to survive one more, but when I go down, they've got a special like overtime mode that gives them a little bit extra so they can survive that last turn, so we could still get a quasi-aborted win. The more I talk about it, the more I would love to see that. So I'm going to say of my top 10, Nations and Shadowrun Crossfire, the two I would most like to see given a really interesting automa system. Okay, then number 4. I noticed in the last several months, maybe a year, you've returned to including extended videos in your run-throughs. I remember a time when you stopped doing this entirely, and I'm curious what brought you to make these videos again. For the record, I think they're great. Well, here's the thing. I stopped doing them because I changed the way that I film. The reason I started doing run-throughs, because if you go back way into the early days, when like my first couple of years, maybe in just my first year of filming, I was just doing everything in just one unbroken stream. And when I realized, I could do this in multiple parts, and that means when my brain is about to melt down and explode, and I'm having a really, really struggling to keep on making more and more turns, I can say, hey folks, why don't you go on ahead and go to the extended playthrough right now? And it could give me a break, and I could walk away, or if I could look up something in the rule book, and then that's where I would put these breaks in. And when I started filming the way I do now, with OBS and whatnot, and I've got a keyboard and webcams, I can pause. If you're looking closely at any run through I do now, if you look at the little picture-in-picture of me in the corner, you will notice that even though I try to make it look seamless, if you're listening, you probably wouldn't notice. It just seems like, oh yeah, he just did one unbroken playthrough. But if you look, you'll see jump cuts where, if I'm stuck or I'm not quite sure what to do, or I need to look something up in the rule books, or I just need a break, or there's somebody at the door, or whatever it might be, I'll hit the pause button. I will remember what sentence did I just say? Sometimes if I know I'm going to step away for a bit, I'll even write it down so I don't forget. And then when I come back, I also make sure that when I unpause, or when I pause, I bring my hands off the screen. So there's nothing moving on screen. So that when I unpause, I just continue the conversation unbroken. And because I remember what sentence I was just saying when I left off, even if I had to write it down, and then my hands come back on screen so you don't see them jump around. You'll only see the jump cut if you look at the little picture-in-picture. And I realized, now that I'm doing this, I don't need to give myself the break. I can give myself a break whenever I want. And it just seemed kind of superfluous, especially because if you go back and look throughout history, the extended run-throughs, they only get a tiny, super tiny fraction of viewers. It's like 10% of people who watch the actual run-through actually stick around for the extended. It's not very much, and that's never really changed. Maybe sometimes 30% of people will go to the extended if I really make them look. There's like a big thing that'll happen in the extended. Maybe they'll stick around, but very, very few people do. But I mean, to be fair, very, very few people stick past the first 10 minutes. They just watch long enough to see maybe one round or even just one turn. So they see, okay, I see what it's like. Okay, fine. I'm going to go to the final thoughts now or whatever. And the vast majority of very, very few people make it to the end. Right? Like 50% of viewers make it to like 5 minutes, of a run through, whether it's an hour-long run through, and a tiny fraction make it to the end. And that same tiny fraction are the ones who will watch the extended. And I'm like, okay, nobody's watching these anyway. I don't need to do them anymore. So why do it? And the thing is, for probably about a year, I stopped doing it. And people kept saying, could you please bring them back? We miss them so much. And I'm like, okay, I'll bring them back. It's a little bit more work because I've got 3 videos I've got to juggle instead of 2, and it's really more work for Paulo because he's got to set up all the cross links between them and stuff like that. But people just really wanted them back. I mean, obviously, you wanted them back. You were happy to see them back. But now here's the trick. you're not really getting that much more. When I stopped doing them in their entirety, what happened is the one run through plus final thoughts just ended up being bigger. It used to be, the run through was like 30 minutes. And then I would do 40 minutes of an extended, right? Or 30 and 30 or 25 and 35 or whatever. And then when I stopped breaking them into separate ones, hey, you'll notice more and more and more, most of my run-throughs are 50 minutes or 60 minutes or 70 minutes. And it's like, okay, you're getting just as much as you ever did. I'm just not doing the extra steps of breaking them into multiple things. But people kept asking for them. And it occurred to me, I was making things a bit worse for the channel. Because if somebody's saying, right, I would like to know about Sagrada. And I do a search on YouTube for Sagrada gameplay. And they see my video and they see other videos. And they see my video, and if it's like in this new mode I was in where, my Sagrada video is 70 minutes long, and meanwhile, somebody else is like 20 minutes long, they're probably going to go watch the 20-minute. Whereas me, if I say, you know what? Hey, I've got my run-through and I've got my extended, I think that makes it more attractive. Because remember, the majority of people aren't going to make it past 5 minutes anyway. And if they see a 60-minute long video, they're going to think, I'll have to watch too long. So it seemed like the right thing to do. People were asking for it back, even if they didn't need it, because they were getting just as much content as ever. But that prompted me to think, I'm making my videos less attractive by not having the 20-minute option or the 30-minute option that then goes into the additional 40 minutes. So that's kind of how things evolved in one direction and then pivoted back to the original direction. And why it's not necessary at all, because the original purpose of them is long gone because of the way I film these days. But that's kind of the story. Okay. Next up, Jack says, did you get approached to cover Flock Together? Its theme seems right up Jen's alley, cooperatively playing as chickens to defend a farm. It does have minor role to resolve, but the theme as well has a cool aging mechanism. You start as chicks and level up to full-grown chickens by the end. Might be enough to win you over. Thoughts, first impressions, reasons you didn't cover it, Jen's impressions of the game? We were contacted by the publisher, and I did read the rules, and I passed. I am curious, because we ended up not covering it. What did anybody else? I am going to look at the secret behind-the-scenes spreadsheet where we keep track, because here's what happens. I have a channel manager now. Folks, I've had him for a few years, ever since we moved back to the States. And whenever a publisher contacts me, I just say, hey, here, contact my channel manager. And then they contact the channel manager. Channel manager gets the rules, sends it out to everybody, collates everybody, sometimes chases people down. It is tough getting Amy and Maggie to commit to stuff because they've got day jobs, and stuff like that, and eventually figures out, right, who would be interested in doing it, puts together a package to tell the publisher, here are your options for coverage of this crowdfunding Kickstarter game, or what have you. But in the meantime, he keeps track of all this on a Google Sheet that I am not showing on screen right now, because there's secret proprietary stuff in there. But let's see, what was the name of it again? It was Flock, right? Flock. Flock Together. Alrighty. I said no. Shay said no. Ruel said yes. And Kimberly said yes. So, that's what Andrew, who, by the way, is the same designer as the designer of Plunderous, and a friend of mine for not quite a decade now, but he's also my channel manager. Anyway, though. So Shay and I passed. Kimberly and Ruel said yes. Amy and Maggie looks like they didn't answer. We've just gotten to the point where, okay, if they don't answer, we just assume that's a no. Probably 1 out of every 30 games, they'll say, oh my gosh, yes, that one. But then it's always tough because most publishers don't want to send prototypes to Australia, which is why even though they do such an amazing job. But anyway, it doesn't matter. So I do not know why Shay said no. And I'm assuming that the publisher said, what often happens is if I say no, but Shay or Kimberly or Ruel or Amy and Maggie say yes, the publishers will often say no because, we really wanted to have Rahdo cover it. Or everybody else on the channel costs significantly less. The video will get just as many views as if I filmed it, or, 80%, maybe 10 or 20% fewer views if Shay filmed it rather than me. But still, this happens over and over and over again, that if Rahdo doesn't want to do it, they just say no. So again, I can't say why Shay said no. And honestly, I could totally understand why Ruel and Kimberly said yes, because it looks great. And a lot of other channels did sign up. But I'll tell you why, Jack. You nailed it. Roll to resolve. I thought, yeah, there was a lot of really cool ideas and stuff in the game, but and I appreciated very much that, the combat resolution from the player's perspective was very deterministic. Right, I know exactly what my chicken is capable of doing. I have to have these resources to be able to pump them into my chicken to convert these resources into damage, and if it's enough damage, I defeat the rampaging ferrets or whatever it is. And I thought, okay, that's cool. But then I saw that every creature has, after you fought them, win or lose, you got to roll a die and have a bunch of stuff happen. And you're right, it is minor. But the thing you got to understand, Jack, whenever any game comes in, I am looking for any excuse at all to pass on it. And if I see roll to resolve, that's almost always, without exception, instant, right, you know what? I'd be happy to watch Kimberly do a video of this and then maybe kick myself because I should have covered it because it looked cooler than I thought it was. To me, roll to resolve is almost without exception, in very few cases, an instant pass. Just not interested. If it's in a co-op game like this, I'm a little bit more accepting of it because, cooperative games are, it's not quite so painful to have, random swings of luck as, hey, if it affects me, it affects everybody because we're all in it together. But there were two things. I was not keen on that. I just saw that and like, oh, everything else is so good. So deterministic, why'd you put this in? It just didn't need to be here. Even if, and I know, like you said, it's very minor. I attack the ferrets, I defeat the ferrets, they roll a die, and it's only a 1 in 6 chance that if I roll the die and they roll a 6, that I don't defeat them, and it makes you lose a turn or whatever. So chances are everything's still relatively deterministic, but I'm just like, you're giving me an easy out. The other thing, though, to be fair, Flock Together is a very pandemic-esque, what do you call it? Spinning plates, right? Emergency management game. There's problems coming from all sides. You got to decide on your turn, logistically, how are you going to spend your meager time that you've got? And if I recall correctly, Flock Together had an action point system like Pandemic, because there's obviously Pandemic is probably one of the most influential board games of all time, because 80% of all co-op games just ape its core structure with, hey, you get so many action points, things attack you from different, you have big objectives you have to do, you have short-term problems you have to solve, and that's what this game was done, but with awesome art from Andrew Bosley, and I really like those books, because you mentioned how the chickens grow up, and they do that with like little flip books, if I recall correctly, something like that. I thought all that was very neat, but you only get 2 action points per turn. And so I'm sitting here thinking, right, okay, I'm reading this rule book. Am I going to want to cover this? Do I think Jen and I will enjoy this? And I came away pretty confident that while I'm confident that if I played it, my response would be, yeah, this game is lovely, but Jen and I, it was not for us because it's too simple. We need something a bit richer, deeper. Not a fan of the roll to resolve. But really what I did is I tried to imagine playing a game of Pandemic, because the game obviously borrows the core structure, where on my turn I only get to do 2 actions instead of 4. And I could instantly imagine how unpleasant that would be, how unsatisfying that would be, how if I were to play a pandemic-inspired game where I only got to do baby turns over and over and over again, where very little happens, that I knew Jen would really dislike it, and it'd be a bummer for her because you're right, she would totally love the cute art and the focus on brave heroic chickens and all that, but yeah. It was those 2 things. Roll to resolve primed me to say no, and then when I figured out, what would Pandemic feel like if I only got 2 action points per turn instead of 4? So I was always just taking half Pandemic turns that I realized, because I have played other Pandemic-inspired games that do that don't give you nice, big, meaty, puzzly turns where I'm trying to figure out, right, okay, I've got 4 action points, I need to get there, how can I get there in time? And reading the rules, there was just nothing deeper in the simulation. You can just instantly teleport wherever you want. There's no issues with trying to get around or tough choices of multi-use cards, which is, at the end of the day, Pandemic is a multi-use card game. That's why it's so brilliant. And Flock Together had some neat stuff, but to me, it struck me as very much a kind of a gateway game for somebody who had, it struck me as kind of being in the same realm as Forbidden Island. And I knew we wouldn't enjoy it. And I knew, I'm looking for any reason not to play a game because there's just too many to play as it is anyway. Plus, I hate stealing the thunder of, hey, Ruel and Kimberly, who both wanted to cover this, and they were excited to cover it, so I'd much rather they cover it. And now, like I said, publishers will often say, oh, if I can't have Rahdo, then we'll move on, and, that's understandable. I wish I could, sometimes I just shake them to make them understand that they'll get just as many views and it will help their project just as much to have Kimberly cover it as me, because they get almost as many views as I do, and they'd be better off having them covered because they'd be genuinely excited about the game. But anyway, sorry. That's why I passed on Flock Together. And who knows? I could be entirely wrong. And, when the game actually does come out, maybe I'll play it somewhere down the road at a convention and I'll say, oh, sometimes I realize I made a terrible mistake and I passed on something and I just didn't see what really made it special. For Flock Together, what really made it special was the amazing art and the wonderful theme. And the gameplay itself seemed kind of, it's fine. And I don't think we would enjoy it. So that's why I said no. And that's just kind of hopefully a bit of an insight into how I go about evaluating games. Because I'm very careful. I say no 9 times out of 10. Amy and Maggie say no 29 times out of 30. Shay probably says no. Shay, I think for the most part, Shay started out saying yes a lot more. But then Shay ran into a couple games where he said yes and then he played it and realized, oh, I hate this game. And he found out there's nothing worse. It's a terrible feeling. Because what you do, and what people will accuse us of doing is, even though we think the game is bad, we'll still go on ahead and review the thing and say it's good because we're all shills for money. And people who say that don't understand. We are so bombarded every month with more games than we could ever cover in a million years. There's simply no reason for us to choose to cover the crappy games, because we can instead cover really good games. Why would we do that? We can't keep up with all the good games that are coming in, so why would we waste our time on bad games? And I remember there's been a couple of times where Shay's like, I just don't know what to do. I wish I'd said no. And we had to, okay, then cut your losses and we will tell the publisher, look, here's why we don't like your game. And here's some feedback if you want, but who would you like us to mail this prototype to? That probably happens to me 3 or 4 times a year. And Shay has gotten very good. It's interesting, it has now happened to Kimberly a couple of times too, where, actually just the last month, she had another one where she said, oh my God, I hate this so much. I wish I'd said no. And, and she's gotten to the point where she's comfortable now saying why she doesn't like it and just, hey, we'll send it on to somebody else. And has that happened to Ruel yet? I think. No, but that's probably only because, Ruel is the newest and, he's less established. So people are, if they can't have me, they'll go for Shay. If they can't have Shay, they'll go for Kimberly. If they can't have Kimberly, they'll go for Ruel. And I think that's just a reflection of Ruel is the newest, whereas Shay is the most established. And of course, I am the most established. So there's a little bit of insight into how things go. Hopefully that was interesting. I don't know. Maybe that was incredibly boring. And that will be the end of this session of the Rahdo Q&A. Thank you, folks, for watching and also for submitting your questions. Send me more to the email address questions@rahdo.com, and I'll get you covered in a future episode. And in the meantime, if you would like to hear some more, you're in luck. I have been doing the Rahdo Talks Through audio podcast for years now with my wife, Jen, and we have got hundreds of hours for you to enjoy. You can hit that big box that's on screen right now if you want to dive deep. Also, you can go on ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next Rahdo Q&A. And thank you, folks, for watching, for listening. Have a very, very nice day. Talk to you later. So long. Bye-bye.